So, is all speech really free? Yes, for the most part. So, you have to remember that speech is not just the spoken word, nor is it the written word, but it also includes symbolic speech. Some example of symbolic speech, most famous case, and the case you need to know, is Tinker versus Des Moines. Mary Beth Tinker was a high school student, and along with her brother, they wore black armbands to protest the Vietnam War back in the 1960s. And the school suspended them for wearing the armbands. The courts ruled that no, this form of speech is protected even in schools because the school didn't really prove they had a compelling interest for punishing the students for the symbolic speech. So if the speech is not posing a threat to the school or the ability of the school to carry out its job, then it is allowed. And the same thing would be in public. If the speech, the symbolic speech or the spoken speech, is not interfering or causing a direct threat to the government's ability to protect the people and serve its purpose, then it really cannot be limited. So this was an important case because it set that precedent. Flag burning has been ruled a form of protected speech. So these are all forms of speech that would be protected. Now, when can the United States limit free speech? Well, if there's a compelling government interest. So this takes us back to the case during World War I, Schenck versus the U.S. So Charles Schenck was convicted of violating the Espionage Act. And that's because he was encouraging people not to register for the draft. And he was actually sending out flyers encouraging people not to register for the draft. The court ruled that this was an okay conviction. So essentially, they ruled in favor of the government because they said that it presented a clear and present danger of keeping the government from being able to protect the country and draft a military and army in the time of war. So this would be an example of when there was a compelling government interest. And it set the tone that First Amendment rights can be restricted during times of war. Certain types of speech are not protected. So examples of speech that are not protected would be libel or slander. Libel is the written word, slander is the spoken word. And this is when you say or write knowingly false information about someone with the intent of damaging their character. So again, it has to be knowingly false when you say it or write it, and it has to have the intent of trying to harm their character. And so this is why you have tabloids who publish a lot of stuff on different celebrities. It's very hard for celebrities to win a libel or slander case because it's very hard to prove that the magazine knew it was knowingly false and did it publish it anyways. And it's hard to prove that they had malicious intent. Obscenity and pornography is also restricted. However, remember, pornography can be considered art, or the case can be made, which is why oftentimes certain things are still allowed. Commercial speech, meaning you're not allowed to do false advertising. You're not allowed to say things that are not true about a product in order to sell it. And then fighting words. So this would be hate speech that is really seen as being a direct threat or could cause, again, that clear and present danger, that obvious and immediate violence. The other speech that is protected, and it applies to the press as well, is that the government cannot enforce something called prior restraint, which means to limit the speech or the press before it is actually said or published. So an example and a key case to know about this is New York Times versus the U.S., where the New York Times, in the height of the Vietnam War, published the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers revealed that for a long time, the Defense Department and the President Johnson had really not been honest about U.S. involvement in Vietnam and how successful or unsuccessful the war was going. And so the Nixon White House sued in response, and the court basically said, like, no, there has to be a very high reason or burden for why something that would justify prior restraint. So prior restraint is also considered protected speech. So look, it says it right above my head. In God we trust. It's printed on all of our paper money. But I thought the First Amendment was about freedom of religion, and part of that means separation of church and state. So yes, there's two parts to the First Amendment freedom of religion clause. The first is the Establishment Clause, which means that officially the federal government cannot establish a national religion, nor can it promote one religion over another, or religion in general over non-religion. But things like In God We Trust, the fact that they pray before sessions of Congress, and we include God in our Pledge of Allegiance is just considered tradition, so it's allowed. It's part of the founding of our country. So over time, the court has developed a test called the Lemon Test because it came about in the Lemon versus Kurtzman case. And basically, it's a 3-part test to determine if something violates the Establishment Clause. So number 1, it says that laws should have a secular or non-religious purpose. 2, they should be neutral toward religion and neither advance nor inhibit religion. And number 3, laws should be not overly entangled with religion. So if any of these is untrue or it violates any one of these, then it is unconstitutional. And the particular case where we talk about this is Engel v. Vitale, which is about the right of prayer in public schools. So in the court case Engel versus Vitale, the court ruled that school-sponsored prayer violated the Establishment Clause, and that should be policy that teachers, administrators, coaches should not lead students in prayer. And so it's not okay, even if the prayer is voluntary, because it's still favoring a religious activity over a non-religious activity. So here's some of the things that are allowed and not allowed in schools with regards to religion. So as I've already said, school-led prayer, teacher-led prayer, Bible reading at a graduation, posting of the 10 Commandments outside of public school, student-led prayer, using state money to pay for Bibles. Activities that are permitted is a moment of silence as long as the purpose is not for prayer. Purchasing textbooks, lunches, bus transportation for private schools. So, for example, our Milford buses provide transportation to many private religious schools, and that is considered to have a non-secular purpose. It doesn't entangle the government with religion too much, and it also just helps protect kids and keep kids safe. Public school building can be used by religious groups, and there could be voluntary after-school Bible study. So those are some of the things that are allowed and not allowed when it comes to prayer in public schools. The other part of the First Amendment freedom of religion is the free exercise clause. And basically, it says everyone should have the right and the freedom to worship whatever religion that they choose, and that the government should not interfere with people's ability to practice their religion freely. However, if the government has a compelling interest, then they do have the right to limit somebody's ability to practice their religion. So, for example, polygamy has a compelling government interest because of some of the economic burdens that can cause. Drug use, for example, in religion can be limited. Not vaccinating children. Those are all examples of ways that the government can limit your freedom of worship. Practices that have been permitted would be Jehovah's Witnesses, their right not to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And that is also a form of symbolic speech, the right not to say something. So that's both freedom of speech and free exercise. The important case to know is Wisconsin versus Yoder. And this was a situation where Amish children were being taken out of school at the age of 14. And they argued when they were forced to follow compulsory education laws, the Amish argued that this went against their religious beliefs, and so they should not be forced to follow these compulsory education laws. In the case, the court basically said that it is the right of the parents to pull their child out of formal education at the age of 14. They felt like it was not going to produce educational benefits, and so the government did not have a compelling interest. So just like having a compelling interest to violate someone's freedom of speech, the same applies to the ability of people to practice their religion freely. There must be a compelling government interest.